Yes, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar Conflict Resolution, which is part of our Get That Job webinar series here at the Champaign Public Library. My name is Jordan Neal, and I am the career librarian here at our library, so thank you all for joining us. For the latest library news and updates, please visit our website, champaign.org, for more information, or you can, of course, follow us on social media if that's an option for you. We are pleased to share that the library is open for grab-and-go service and computer use. Once again, just visit our website for more information, or you could, of course, give us a call, or you can email librarian@champaign.org. You can even chat with us just by visiting the homepage of our website. We're still offering our Book a Librarian service virtually. If you need any help at home to request a session, just visit champaign.org/bookalibrarian to fill out a request form. We are also still offering our curbside services if you would prefer to come in or prefer not to come inside the library. And our e-library is always open where you can enjoy those ebooks, movies, and more using your Champaign Public Library card, or you could sign up for a virtual library card through our website for instant access. Moving on to a couple of Zoom features available to you that might help during this webinar. Depending on your computer or device, you will see a chat and raised hand option. Clicking on the chat will open or close a chat box on the right side of your Zoom window, or sometimes it displays in the middle of your screen and you can drag it around again depending on your computer or device. You also have the option to raise hand to receive assistance. You can use this if you have any technical difficulties or you'd like to speak and ask a question, and then we can unmute you if you prefer not to type in the chat. We invite you to use the chat or raise hand option to ask any questions or leave any comments. I'm sure our presenter will be happy to pause for any questions, but it might be best to save them for the end. It's up to you. I would also like to remind everyone that our webinars are recorded, so just be mindful when you share those questions and comments. And then finally, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Joshua Ford, who is an instructor at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. He teaches communication, professional and computer skills, where he guides students in the creation of their personal brand and development of communication and networking skills. Thank you, Joshua, for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jordan. It's a pleasure to be here today, pleasure to be with you all, and I appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you all this evening. Let me go ahead and just transition to sharing my screen with you all. So give me a moment while I make that transition. Okay. Okay, yeah, so let me just start out by sharing, I won't go into a lot of detail about my own background, but I wanted to share why conflict resolution is important to me, why it's been important in my career. I have a little bit of a background in working with students in particular as they're navigating conflict, whether that is in a personal or professional settings. In a previous role before making my way to Indiana University, I worked as a restorative justice coordinator at St. Louis University, where I managed restorative justice programs, restorative practices, as well as running mediation programs. I also got my start at Indiana University actually as a residence hall coordinator, where I managed one of our residence halls that housed 1,300 students living in a residence hall or a dorm on campus. And you can imagine, with 1,300 students living in small confined spaces together, there were lots of opportunities to practice conflict resolution. And so it's been an important part of my career in that respect, but it's also been important to me because I'm a human being who is also experiencing conflict with folks at the workplace, right? And in fact, any place that we are working with one other person, conflict has a chance to occur. I might even suggest that in places maybe where we're working autonomously, we might be experiencing some structural conflicts, such as time restraints, right? That maybe it doesn't even take another human being involved in this scenario for us to experience conflict. So I'm really excited to be able to share some thoughts and hear from you all today. If you do have questions throughout our session, please feel free to throw up your hand and be happy to hear from you, happy to hear your comments in the chat. Maybe Jordan can help me manage that chat feature as well as we go through. So once again, welcome. So let me hide my face here for a moment, or maybe we can just tuck that up in the corner. I've got a few learning objectives for us today that I want us to cover. I want us to think about what are some of the root sources of conflict between individuals in the workplace. So where is this all coming from? What's causing us to experience this conflict at all? And then I also want us to think about what are some actual helpful tools that we can walk away from today's session with. What's going to be beneficial? What's something that you can actually apply after you leave here today? Such as how to address conflict between peers or with your supervisor. Maybe that also shows up with customers or clients that you might be working with in your job or in your career as well. We're going to talk about some communication strategies to try and achieve a desirable outcome for the parties involved in that conflict. And I also want us to think about what it might be like to implement some mediation strategies for opportunities where you might be seen as a leader in the workplace. Maybe you're a supervisor, manager, shift leader. Maybe you're just seen as a respected colleague who people seek out for advice. In what situations in the workplace have you already perhaps been asked to help two folks or more resolve a potential conflict they're involved in? So I want us to think about it from multiple perspectives, conflicts that you're personally invested in, as well as conflicts that you may just be supporting others as they navigate. And I always like to start out with maybe a bit of a call to action here, and I want to share this quote with you. If you're going to be viewed as a leader in your organization and survive and thrive at work, you must develop your own conflict resolution approach and develop a reputation for leadership and conflict management and consensus building. So again, anytime there's two or more people in a workplace, conflict is probably going to arise. And so part of our professional reputation, part of our brand is always going to include our ability to work with others. And in fact, we might even suggest that it's even more important than some technical skills or industry skills, that our ability to work with others to manage conflict appropriately is going to be critical to our success. But I've got a few studies that I want to share with you. And the first is that the National Association of Colleges and Employers in 2017 did a job outlook survey, and they asked employers, what's the number one thing that you look for in a candidate and a potential employee? And the number one thing that these recruiters and employers said was they look for the ability to work on a team. The Center for Creative Leadership for Fortune 100 companies said that one of the three main reasons for failure is the inability to work well on a team. So that gives us our call to action here. Relationship management, the ability to have self-awareness and self-management. These are critical pieces to our career, right? And in not just getting a job and being able to communicate how we work on teams, right? You know you're going to get asked that in an interview someday. Tell us about a time that you worked on a team, right? But also how do we maintain that success once we get the job, right? How do we maintain our relationships when we're in the job? So when we think about self-awareness, your ability to accurately perceive emotions and stay aware of them as they happen. That's step number one, right? Then step two, of course, is the self-management. So once I have an idea of these emotions and what comes up for me when I'm in a conflict, how can I use that and leverage that to my success, to stay flexible, to stay positive, to show up as my best possible self? It's something for us to think about. And so when we think about that self-awareness piece, take a temperature, right? When you're engaged in a conflict, when if a customer were to yell at you at your job, right? I hope that never happens to anyone. But if it were to happen, if you were involved in a conflict, what responses might you notice even in your body, right? Maybe your thoughts, but I know that for me, sometimes maybe my heart starts to race a little bit faster, right? Maybe I may notice my hand starts to shake because I'm starting to feel nervous that someone has confronted me about something, right? What are those physical reactions that you might experience when involved in a conflict? The other piece could be in just thinking about your thoughts, right? Do you feel embarrassed? Do you feel shut down? Is it hard for you to even formulate a response at all? Maybe on the other hand, you're someone who is quick to respond, right? You're instantly ready to maybe fire something back, right? You're furthering the conflict. So having that self-awareness, that self-management piece, for us to be able to show up as our best possible self is critical because when our heart starts to race a little bit faster, when the blood gets pumping, it's hard to be our best. Right? So we need to have a strategy. We need to have an approach before entering into that conflict, or else we're going to resort to some default settings, right? That we may not show up as our best self. So there's a few conflict resolution strategies, and some of these are more effective than others. But I want you to think about as you're watching this at home, what are some conflicts that you've been in the past, and how have you responded or addressed those? So this is sort of taking us through a range here of a few different styles or strategies. The first strategy that we think about is avoidance. And this has a bit of a negative connotation to it. And actually, folks that are practicing an avoidance strategy may or may not have negative or positive intentions here, right? A lot of times, folks that are practicing avoidance, you might hear them say things like, I'm going to try to be the bigger person here. I am going to just let that go. I'm going to let that slide off my back. I can't possibly address every conflict that comes up. I'm just going to let that go and be the bigger person. We wouldn't think of that necessarily as a negative conflict resolution strategy. Unfortunately, though, when we do adhere to that strategy of avoidance, that conflict never got resolved. And so chances are it's going to come back up for us at some point. And we might have to address it then when it becomes more serious, or as things have gone unresolved. Perhaps it starts to feel even more strained. The next strategy that we think about is called accommodation. And this might look like someone who does attempt to confront the negative behavior or the conflict that's occurred. And they say, yeah, I wanted to bring something to your attention. We've got a conflict here. But when the other party comes in and says, well, here's what I'm thinking, here's what my concern is, they say, oh, okay, I understand. Let's let that go. Right? They'll just say, whatever you need, whatever you want, let's just move forward with that. Not a big deal, right? This person doesn't have bad intentions, but when we think about the needs and the desires of the people involved in this conflict, one party's getting met, the other party isn't. Chances are that conflict is going to keep coming back up. The next strategy that we think about is called competition. And this one also, I think, has a bit of a negative connotation to it, right? In that maybe some people, as opposed to the avoidance or the accommodation, people who want to stay away from conflict, a person who has a competition style might be energized by that conflict, or they might even think of themselves as an advocate. I'm going to fight for what's right. I'm going to fight for the right thing out of this scenario. And so that's going to show up in maybe the energy level that's associated with this conflict. The next strategy we think of is called compromise. And this is maybe the one that has the most positive association, and maybe what we've been taught in the past as the ultimate goal, right? If we're in a conflict, the best thing that we can do is reach a compromise. And that can be helpful because not every conflict that we're involved in has a clear-cut, easy solution. In fact, perhaps most won't have a clear-cut solution. But I'll tell you, I get concerned when we prioritize compromise, because what is compromise? Right? We've got two parties that have needs and investments in a conflict. And what we're saying is that each party gives up a little bit of something to reach an agreement. Now, that can be helpful, but at the end of the day, we've still got needs not being met. And so later on down the road, how is this going to show back up? The last stage, and maybe what we might say is our ideal stage, is collaboration. And in a collaborative environment, all needs are being addressed in this conflict, right? We've reached solutions where the main points have been addressed, where people can walk away saying, we've got a strategy to move forward, and no one's having to give something up. Now that's ideal, and we might not always reach that point. But ultimately, that can be a good benchmark for us to try to reach for. So as you look at these, what strategy most feels comfortable for you? Where do you see yourself showing up? And this may be different in your personal life as well as in the workspace, right? So when you're at work, maybe you try to show up a little bit more professional, right? You try to show up a little bit more calm, collected, versus maybe in your personal life, you don't hold back, right? Maybe you show up differently. That could be, it could be the opposite, right? But what style most feels comfortable for you? And has that been successful for you in the past? I wanted to think about what are some sources of conflict? What types of conflict might we see in the workplace? And there's a few examples here for you. The first one is what we might think of as data conflicts. This could show up in a couple of different ways. In its purest form, we might have folks looking at data, at some numbers, and they've got disagreements about where these numbers come from and what they mean. In a more maybe applicable sense, this could show up as misinformation or lack of information. So imagine with me that you're in a workplace and a new policy has been implemented. And you're not quite aware of what this policy is or what the expectations are of you. However, a supervisor or manager has held you responsible for not meeting those new expectations. So all of a sudden we've got a conflict based on a lack of information. You're being held accountable to expectations that weren't communicated to you. The next source of conflict, and probably the most common that we're going to see in the workplace, are relationship conflicts. This is about repeated or repetitive negative behavior. This shows up in our personal life too, right? Maybe we have a friend, a loved one, a family member who consistently engages in a behavior that drives us crazy, right? Or that makes us feel frustrated with them. And maybe the first time we might be in this honeymoon phase, right? Maybe we've started a new job, or maybe in our personal life, we're in a new romantic relationship, and we might call that the honeymoon phase, referring to we're just getting started, we're just getting to know each other in this new job or in this new relationship. And so if there's a conflict that comes up, I'm not going to address it because I don't want to rock the boat. Let's just all try to get along. But what ends up happening is that behavior then doesn't get addressed. It continues as a repetitive negative behavior, and it really starts to dig at us. And so by the 15th time that behavior happens, we're perhaps less likely to keep our calm, cool, and collected self. Okay, the next area is thinking about values conflicts. This really we can think about as right versus wrong. Have you ever been in a workplace where maybe a supervisor or manager has asked you to do something you thought wasn't right or wasn't ethical? How would you respond if that occurred? This could also show up as ideological differences, and I hope that no one is ever in a situation where you're having to make these ethical judgments, but in my experience, these things do occur, these things do happen. And so how would you navigate that conflict, especially when we're thinking about the extra layer of conflict with the supervisor, and how that's going to make things even more complicated, and how we address and respond to this values right or wrong conflict. The next area is structural conflict. We might think about this in terms of unequal resources or time constraints. In its most simplest form, perhaps my supervisor assigns me 15 hours worth of work on a project and wants it done by the end of the week. But I've only got 10 hours left of my time that I'm able to contribute to this project. So now we've got a structural conflict. I've not got the time available to successfully complete this project to meet expectations. And so how am I going to resolve this structural issue, this issue of a time constraint? Okay, our last area here is of interest conflicts. And this could be perceived or actual competition over wants or needs. And so when I think about this area, I think about perhaps in the workplace, there are opportunities or projects that not everyone is going to get the opportunity to serve on, to take advantage of. So there's competition between coworkers, right? About who's going to get the best spot, who's going to get the desirable shift, right? Maybe we're competing for specific work hours or specific projects, and maybe those that conflict isn't even showing up in reality, but we perceive it to be there, right? So I imagine that everyone is going to be competing for the same projects to work on. But in reality, that might not even be the case, but it still could develop as complex feelings or feelings of animosity towards another person on your team as a result of that. And so it's important for us to, again, have that self-awareness, self-management ability. In its most simplest form, causes of conflict in the workplace can show up in between managers and employees, between employee. It could show up between employees and customers or the clients that you're working with. And maybe one of the most sensitive areas where we see conflict take place is in these workplace evaluations, right? Because perhaps these workplace evaluations are also being used to determine whether or not you're getting a raise at your workplace for that year. And so these areas become pretty sensitive when we're thinking about our livelihood, about our take-home pay from our job. And so these workplace evaluations do tend to be a source of conflict. And perhaps we have a manager or a supervisor who's not shared some concerns with us until we reach that workplace evaluation. We might be hearing some critical feedback for the first time. Now, if you're a manager at home listening to this, you know that would be not an ideal situation for your employees to be hearing critical feedback for the first time in an evaluation. That wouldn't be fair, right? And so how do we best prepare ourselves as managers to address conflicts or concerns before reaching that place in the year where we're giving that formalized feedback? Now, we're getting ready to talk about what are some actual strategies that we can implement to manage conflict effectively. Before we get to that, I just want to acknowledge that we do need to address conflict. And it doesn't mean that every battle that comes across our workplace or our plate, so to speak, we don't have to take on every challenge ourselves. We might have to pick and choose what our priorities are. But if there's something serious going on, right? If there's something that is repetitive in nature, if this is going to come back up again, we're responsible for addressing that conflict. And the risk of not addressing those conflicts is what we like to think of as the spiral of unmanaged conflict. So as time goes on and conflict doesn't get addressed, there's a couple of things that we can expect to have happen. Positions harden. What are we talking about when we say positions harden? So if we have a conflict with a peer in the workplace, if we were to address it the first time, we might say, hey, I wanted to let you know something came up in our staff meeting that we had today. And I walked away from our staff meeting feeling a little bit uncomfortable about what happened. And I just wanted to acknowledge that with you. And if that could not, whatever happened, if that could not happen again, that would be appreciated. That would be great. Right? That it might be as simple as that, as just acknowledging that in the future, our expectations will be that something different occurs. Now, if conflict goes unaddressed and the positions harden, what we might say instead is to our manager, we might say, I can't work with this person anymore. I don't want to be on the same team as them. Right? And so all of a sudden, we've got some pretty hard demands as opposed to being able to address and successfully navigate a conflict successfully. Communication stops. Right? How often have you seen this in personal conflicts in your own life, or perhaps even in the workplace, where we might find ourselves saying, you know what, I don't have to be friends with that person. I just have to work with them. That's not a bad motto necessarily. However, what people often mean when they say that is, I'm not going to talk to them except if I absolutely must. And that really doesn't encourage a sense of meaningful relationships that we want to think of when we think about being successful in the workplace. Next, we think about additional parties being pulled into this conflict. So, if a conflict is going unaddressed, are we reaching a point where we can't resolve it on our own? We're having to pull in our supervisor. Are we having to get HR involved? Well, folks, that's time, that's energy, that's resources from the company that's being invested into resolving a conflict that we're experiencing in the workplace. And that's not good for our overall brand, or thinking about how we want to be perceived at work. Next is thinking about these distorted perceptions. I think about sometimes in my personal life, if I've let something go, or I might even have a friend come up and call me and say, they say, "Hey, Josh, I want to vent to you about something. I'm really frustrated with my partner, my friend, or someone that I work with." And I say, "Well, tell me what's going on. What's happening?" And they say, "Well, you know," and they'll give me the example of what's happened. And it's something so small. It's something so small that I really can't understand what's happened to make them feel so frustrated, to make them maybe to the point of tears. And I think to myself, well, it seems like they may be overreacting. But what's behind that is maybe a history of unresolved conflicts. And so maybe this conflict that we're discussing, that our friend is venting to us about, it really has nothing to do with this specific situation, but maybe weeks, months, or even years of unresolved conflict that's making them feel so frustrated. And it's showing up as now they're being unreasonable or irrational. They're showing up with distorted perceptions. So it really is important and critical for us to maintain an active conflict resolution strategy within our work. Ignoring conflict or saying, "I'm going to let that go," really, it's not our best strategy. So now let's talk about what are these tools for managing conflict. We've got a little pyramid here of different examples of conflict resolution strategies. And what we want to do is start at the top of this pyramid and work our way down. Okay, so the very first thing that we want to do, and this could be whether we're involved in a conflict or whether we're a leader in the workplace or as a manager helping to resolve a conflict, we want to start with active listening. So often in my career, I've had folks tell me, you know, I just want to be heard, or I just want an apology, right? I just want to be heard out. How often have you seen that with maybe customers in the workplace where they say, you know, I just want to express that I'm unhappy with a service or a product that I've received. I don't need anything. I don't need a refund. I don't need anything to come out of this. I just want to let someone know that I wasn't happy with what happened. Maybe you've experienced that firsthand. Maybe you've experienced that as an employee. But that's part of that active listening, is people need to feel heard. They need to feel understood. Okay. Our second strategy is asking the right questions. So once folks have had an opportunity to share their story with us, how can we dig in a little bit, ask some good questions, ask the right questions to maybe understand what the background is, right? Or what we need to do to move forward out of this place. The next thing that we think about is positions versus interests. And in each of these categories, we're going to talk about more in depth. But just to give you a little teaser here, when we think about positions versus interests, how do we approach a conflict? Whoever it's with, how are we approaching this? Do we come in and say to our boss, "I deserve a raise"? That would be an example of a position. I deserve a raise. An interest that expresses a similar comment would be, you know, speaking to your boss and saying, "You know, over the past several years, I've included some new projects, some new responsibilities under my portfolio, or I've really been able to improve my quality of work over these past couple of years. And I've not necessarily seen that reflected in my pay scale at this point. I'm wondering if you could discuss some options with me. What might be fair and a reasonable expectation based on my performance that I'm giving at the workplace now?" Okay. That would be an example of an interest, right? Explaining where you're coming from. Okay. The next category here that we can think about in the next tool is reframing. Okay. So imagine with me that you're working in the food industry, for example. And in the food industry, maybe a customer comes up and says, "I am really just disgusted with my meal that I had today. This was not good. This, you know, really is not the same quality of food that I'm used to getting at this restaurant. We're not going to hear that and then say, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, your food was so gross. That's not acceptable. Right? That would be unprofessional to make a comment like that in the workplace. However, it is important for that customer to feel heard and for that customer to feel understood. So what we might do in that situation is reframe what they've just told us so that they still feel heard, but we don't have to repeat the negative language that maybe they've associated with the issue. Instead, we might say, I understand this meal didn't meet your expectations. Let me see what I can take care of for you. Right? At which point, maybe we consult with a manager, we consult with someone else about solutions, right, that we can offer to this customer. But we're not going to repeat, oh, I'm sorry, your meal was disgusting, right? That's not our goal. The last thing that we're going to do when we're in a conflict is then start to generate solutions. Okay, that's not the starting point, and we have to resist the urge that when someone tells us their story, we have to resist the urge of saying, okay, well, I've got a couple of ideas of how we can take care of this right away. When we jump to solutions too quickly, we might not understand the full picture. We might not have the full story about what's taken place. The feelings and the emotions behind what's occurred might not feel addressed. Okay, so that we're going to save that as our last step. Right? Let's take a deeper look at each of these areas. One of the things that we want to think about is our information gathering process when we're listening to someone's story and then we're ready to ask some questions. What we want to do is try to ask open-ended questions, questions that require more than just a simple yes or a no reply. How can we get folks to start communicating? If you're in a conflict with a fellow peer, or you're a manager managing a conflict between two employees, how do we start to rebuild open lines of communication? And I'll give you another tip. If you're a manager and you're mediating a conflict between two employees, they might be inclined to talk through you, right? Even if the three of you are sitting in a room together, they might be inclined to look to you and say, here's what I'm really concerned about. Your job in that scenario then is to say, talk to them, talk to your peer that's sitting here. Let's open up these lines of communication and get a dialogue going. That's our first step. Examples of these open-ended questions are, can you tell me about this situation? How did this problem occur? What created this? What's been the impacts on you and others? That's one of my favorite questions to ask. How have you been impacted by this? I enjoy that question because it really helps the other party involved in this conflict to start to understand in a little better detail what the impacts of their actions might have been, right? And that might lead someone to be more open to coming to a compromise or coming to that collaboration that we talked about earlier. Okay. Next, we can think about our position versus interest statements. And I've got a couple of examples for us to look at here. Position statements are demands, they're wants, what someone thinks should happen. Now, examples of that might be, I deserve to get higher marks on my quarterly evaluation, or I need you to give me next Saturday off work. These are demands, especially when we're working with a supervisor, when we're working with our manager. We need to find a way to help our supervisor be our ally. I think you would be surprised to see how much a good supervisor, right, would be willing to support you, willing to help you address your needs when we give them the opportunity to work with us. But when we're putting them on the defensive end by issuing these demands, people don't want to work with that person. People don't want to say, oh, well, you came into my office and made some demands, so sure, you can have a raise, right? That's really not how conflicts get resolved in the workplace, right? We really want to try and help people help us. Let's set them up for success. How do we give them the right interests in order for them to be our ally? Here's an example of what that might feel like when we're expressing our desires and our concerns. We might say instead, I feel that I've been consistently exceeding expectations in my customer service reviews, which I had hoped to see reflected in my quarterly evaluation. So maybe we're not seeing this quality piece. Maybe someone has forgotten about your excellent work in the customer service aspect of your job. That might help us to have a different conversation. Our supervisor might say, you know what, that's right. We've not seen that reflected in your evaluation yet. Okay, the next example is, this coming Saturday, my family needs my help. However, I'm scheduled to work. Can we explore some options together to resolve this? Let's collaborate together, right? When we're thinking about scheduling conflicts, a lot of times there's not a lot of flexibility. But if we ask the right questions, we might find out that there's some additional solutions, right? So the solution might not be that you get the day off, but that your hours could be adjusted, right? The work gets done earlier in advance, right? So what are our options here? Moving on to reframing. Remember we talked about if a customer says, my food was disgusting, right? We're not going to repeat back, wow, your meal was really gross, right? That's not what we're going to say. Reframing is restating what the speaker has said in order to remove the negative overtones or words. Or we could be helping them to take a statement that's a position and turning it into an interest, right? We can help role model some positive conflict resolution strategies for them. The other thing that I want you to remember when you're listening to someone who's expressing their concerns is to avoid evaluative encouragers. What am I talking about when I say that? This could be something very small, right? So if the customer is telling us that their meal was gross, maybe we don't say, oh yeah, it was really disgusting, but we say, right, yep, I understand, yep, right? Those small things like saying, yep, right, I understand, may give the indication that we agree, right? And that maybe becomes even more relevant if we're thinking about conflicts between peers in the workplace. Maybe you're the manager and your employee, Sally, comes up and says, John has not been carrying his weight on the team. He has not been doing his part. And you say, yep, right, yep. That is going to leave, that gets back to our employee, John. That might not feel so good, right? To have the impression that maybe you were agreeing with Sally, what she was saying. So we want to avoid those small gestures when we're listening to someone share their concerns with us. Here are some examples of how we could reframe comments that we might hear as a mediator or as a manager even. So the first example is, he is so lazy, he never cleans up his desk. We might reply and say, it sounds like it's really important for you to have a clean workspace. The next example, I have never met someone as nosy as her. She is constantly butting into my business. There are times that you'd like a certain level of privacy. The last example, my boss is a complete micromanager. It sounds like you want more autonomy in your job. How we reframe, how we repeat back a message that we hear can help us start to lay the foundation to having a more productive conversation. It's more positive and leaves people walking away with a more positive association of the outcomes. Our last step when mediating a conflict is generating solutions. We want to save this for the very end. We want to give people a time to have their concerns heard, to really understand what are the root causes of this conflict. And I want to give you a tip here. If you're that mediator, if you're not personally involved with the conflict, I suggest avoiding making suggestions, right? Because here's what happens, and based on personal experiences even, if you start out by saying, well, I've heard both sides, have you guys thought about trying this solution? Well, what happens if they try that solution and it fails? All of a sudden, you're now part of that conflict. They come back and they say, well, Josh, you said that we should try this, and I am not pleased with what's happened since. Like that wasn't good for me. Okay? So if I'm the mediator, I try to avoid taking part in the solution generating. Now, they might get stuck on their own, right? If we say, what do you think we should do moving forward from here? What are some ideas for solutions? Maybe the two people that we're working with, two or more, right? Maybe they're having trouble identifying what an appropriate solution would be. if you get stuck, one of my favorite questions to ask is, what would be the best case scenario for you out of all of this? What would be the ideal outcome? What would you like to see? Okay. I also like to ask, what would the worst case scenario be? If we can't come to a solution here, what's the worst case scenario? What's going to happen? That gives folks an idea of sort of our benchmarks here about what the consequences are if we can't come to a solution, as well as being able to envision what it might look like to be able to successfully manage this conflict in the workplace. How can we really move forward from this space with a meaningful outcome where people's needs are being met? And that's something that we can strive towards. Some other strategies that you can use are, of course, the highlight common ground. So you might say, I've heard both sides of the story in this conflict. One thing that I noticed that was similar is that both of you have shared a similar concern about this. Let's start there. We found at least one place where we're in agreement, right? Where can you find that common ground? The other piece of advice that I have for you is to start with the easiest issues first. If we've got a long-term conflict between two employees in the workplace, you might hear language like, well, I can't trust her anymore. I don't trust him to be on my team anymore, right? Trust, that's a big issue for us to tackle in a 1 or 2 hour mediation that we're facilitating, right? We might not be able to come up with the perfect solution right away. And chances are, in reality, we won't be able to address trust within a mediation. That's something that's going to be addressed over time. So what are some small things that we can do today to address some of these pressing issues? Let's start with the smallest issues and see where we can reach some compromises or collaborations together. There's also some behaviors that we want to avoid, behaviors that tend to lead to escalation in a part of a conflict. The first, of course, is avoidance. As we've mentioned, we might be in that honeymoon phase. We might not want to rock the boat. Maybe we're afraid to address conflict because of implications that it could have. But ultimately, avoiding conflict leads to that spiral of unresolved conflict, and it makes things worse. We also need to be really careful about how we're implementing humor into workplace conflict, right? There's a time and a place for humor. There's a time and a place to have a good laugh. But if someone's feelings are really hurt and they feel like we're making light of the situation, that may not be the best strategy for us to implement here. And so if you're someone who has a good sense of humor, you might have to put that on the back burner when we're managing this conflict. One of the other lessons I've learned through working with a lot of college students over the years is that text and email is really not our best strategy for resolving a conflict. Now, text and email, especially email, has its place in the workplace for resolving a conflict, but it's not our first option. Now, here's what I mean. If you get a conflict from a peer or from a supervisor, and they're addressing some concerns that they have with you, that might not land well, right? We don't know the tone that they intended for that email. So we might read it as really harsh or really critical, and that might not have been the sender's intentions. Right? So we really want to prioritize some face-to-face conversation. And if we can't get face-to-face, maybe over Zoom or even over the phone could be better options for us than just sending a quick text or email, because we can't control how the reader hears our message. We can't control the tone that they interpret our email to be. Now, email does have a place in workplace conflicts. And so sometimes it's important for us to have a record of conversations that were addressed, right? So if I've given feedback to my supervisee about something that really wasn't appropriate, something that took place that wasn't okay, I'm going to have a face-to-face conversation and address those issues. But my follow-up then is to send an email and say, thank you so much for spending some time to have a conversation with me today. I'm really glad that we were able to come up with solutions including X, Y, and Z examples, right? Including these solutions, and moving forward, I know that we're going to have a more productive workspace. Right? Now I have a record that I gave you that feedback, right? I've sent that in a documented email, but the actual meat of the conversation, the meaningful dialogue happened face to face so that they could feel heard and so that they can hear my tone and not misinterpret my intentions. My intentions when navigating a conflict with an employee are never to have someone's feelings be hurt. Most of us are very sensitive to that. So we want to leave people walking away from conflict feeling like a whole person. Like they don't feel judged. They don't feel like they've really been torn down. They walk away understanding that there's a need for improvement. Lastly, we want to avoid responding when angry. Okay, this can be something that's challenging to do. But remember, one of our first conversations tonight was, if your heart starts racing, if you feel like you're short of breath, right? If you're feeling really frustrated, and you're noticing that physical response, take a deep breath and say, I'm going to step away from this conflict for right now, and I'll address it when I'm in a better headspace. Time does help. Time gives us perspective, and we can really reflect on what the important things are to resolve in this conflict. So time helps, but avoidance hurts, right? We're not going to say, I'm going to let that go. We're going to give it time and revisit it when we're in a better headspace, when we can show up as our best possible self. So some reflection questions that I have for you and want you to think about at home. Are there conflicts in your past that you have seen, and how did you respond? Or did you not know how to respond? Are there things that you would do differently now that we've had this conversation, right? Now that we've reflected on some different conflict resolution strategies or mediation options, how would you respond to that conflict differently? If you can't think of a workplace example, maybe you can think of a personal example, something that you've seen that didn't go as planned. What would you do differently? Something to think about at home. Folks, that's the slides that I've got for you today. I'm going to stop the screen share at this point, and I would love to invite, if you have questions, comments, concerns, what are some things that you want to talk about? What are you thinking about today? We'll pull up the chat feature here and see if there's anyone want to raise their hand or speak out. Happy to hear from you.
Yes, please feel free to type in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. You can speak.
That sounds great.
In the meantime, Josh, that was great. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I did have a question. I'll send my question in the chat. Just for fun.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on conflict within a group setting with multiple team members? Examples including committees or group work. Yeah. This can be really challenging when we're navigating conflicts that include the whole team. It's harder to have a productive conversation when we've got multiple parties involved. Now, there may not be a perfect way to address this, but here's my tips. So more is not merrier, right? And so maybe we might look at our committee, look at our team and say, there's some conflicts that are going on where there's lots of people involved, but maybe not everyone on the committee is involved in that conflict. So let's take a moment to really critically reflect and say, where is the source of this conflict and who are the parties involved? Let's get those folks together and have a conversation there. But really our default, we don't want to be, say, let's pull everyone in. Now, it is important though that everyone who is involved in the conflict for them to be present at the same time. It is not going to be helpful for us to pull a group of people together with small groups at a time and say, let's come up with some solutions. But then we pull group number 2 in and we say, okay, what ideas do you have? And all of a sudden we're not in alignment anymore. We've not resolved those hurt feelings across different groups. So whoever is involved does need to be present at the same time. Now, there are some strategies, and we might think about strategies that are related to restorative justice, or what we call talking circles is a good practice within restorative justice or restorative practices. And so this talking circle, we might put everyone in a room, put our chairs in a circle, and everyone gets to go around and have their voice heard. That's a way for us to manage a conversation or a dialogue without having people speaking over each other, trying to jump in. We might have some people that are more introverted feeling like, I didn't get my chance to speak. I didn't get my chance. And so if that's occurring, how do we facilitate a dialogue? And that talking circle could be a really good strategy.
Well, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, any other questions that I can answer for you?
All right, we'll be on the lookout for those if they come up. Oh, we have a question here.
Okay, yeah, good. So we've got a question that says, can you give any tips for working through conflict across different cultures? Yeah, so when I'm reading this question, there may be specific context that that I don't know, and so it's hard for me to maybe address the specifics of that. But what first comes to my mind is that across maybe cultural differences, there might be different communication strategies. That's one thing that we know to be true, especially if we're working in the world of international business, right, that we're working with people who are from different cultures. They may have a different level of comfort navigating conflict that comes up. We've got a clarification here. Mostly language backgrounds or nationalities. Excellent. Great. So when we're working with folks with different communication or conflict styles, folks may be more or less likely to engage directly with conflict. Some cultures might say, we prefer to sort of speak around the topic. Other cultures may be very direct in their communication style. And I think it's about, as a mediator within that conflict, being able to accept that there's no one right way. There's not one culture that's the right way of addressing conflict. And so how do we do some prep work with our employees before entering into that mediation or that dialogue? So I might sit down with someone and say, how would you respond when we have this conversation? If you felt the conversation was too direct, how would that make you feel, and how would you respond? Would you be comfortable with that? And if not, how would you communicate that your feelings had been hurt? Right. So it has to do with that pre-mediation prep work that we can do. Can be the most helpful strategy for us to prepare folks that we might have a conversation that isn't comfortable for you. And that's okay, as long as we can still be respectful.
Oh, great. Thank you for that question. All right, well, while we wait for more questions, I have my contact information here in case you want to reach out. We are still scheduling our one-on-one meetings where we're helping people with resume reviews, crafting your cover letter. We've been meeting with people through Zoom, but we can meet through a platform that you're comfortable with. So feel free to reach out. Once again, Josh, thank you so much. That was really great.
Thank you.
Our next career webinar will be this Tuesday, March 16th at 7 p.m. It will be online job search strategies presented by Parkland College's career counselor, Brennan Hightower. And she'll just discuss some general thoughts to keep in mind when you're starting that job application all the way to when you're submitting that job application. So we hope you'll join us for that. We have a lot more career webinars coming up. Here are the ones coming up for March. After that, we have resume basics, and then we have tech tips for your job search, where I will be presenting alongside the library's technology librarian, Susan Winkler. And yeah, we have a lot more webinars coming up related to our business series, our career series, of course, our writers workshops, our crafty adults. We hope you can join us. Just visit champaign.org/events for more information. And I have our contact information here if you want to reach out for any further questions. Let me start my video again. There I am. Oops. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions right now. Thank you again, Josh. I think I'll go ahead and end the webinar, and I wish everyone a good night. Take care.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.